I never thought I'd discover the truth inside our own barn. Today, at 68, I still live on the same ranch in rural Montana. The mountains still frame the horizon, the wind still howls through the timber fences, and the church bell still tolls at 9 every Sunday morning. From the outside, almost nothing has changed, but there is a specific kind of silence that only a betrayed woman understands. It all started on a cold October afternoon. I went into the barn looking for old cattle records. The co-op had asked for updated copies, and as always, I was the one responsible for the paperwork. Throughout 32 years of marriage, I was the one who managed the books, every loan paid, every calf sold, every tax return filed. I never had a single reason to doubt him. Deep in the back of the barn, behind an old tool cabinet, I found a small metal box, gray, locked. We never locked anything out there. It wasn't curiosity that made me pick it up. It was a strange sensation, as if something were physically out of place. The key was hanging behind the supply room door. When I opened that box, I found contracts folded with far too much care, partial property transfers, changes in beneficiaries, bank statements, in the name of a woman I had never heard of, monthly payments, values that didn't match feed, machinery, or taxes, too frequent to be an accident. I didn't cry. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, just staring at those papers. The kettle whistled, and I didn't even move. 32 years, a whole life built on that land, and yet that box existed. That night, I served dinner like I always do. He kicked his boots off at the door, washed his hands, and asked about the day. We said grace before the meal. I watched the man I had shared 3 decades with and wondered at what point he started living a life that no longer included me. 2 days later, the truth stopped being a hidden paper. At the local bank, the one where everyone knows us by our first names, we were called in for account updates. The manager couldn't meet my eyes. Part of the ranch had been registered with formal changes, without my signature, without my knowledge. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, hands crossed over my purse, my husband staring at the table. The humiliation didn't make a sound. There were no screams, just a weight in my chest that felt like it was crushing the air out of me. I walked out of there slowly. I greeted 2 women from church on the sidewalk. I smiled. I asked about the Sunday meeting. Inside, something had broken in a way that didn't make a sound. I didn't know then how long it had been going on, or how far he had gone, or who else knew. I only knew that the life I had defended with such loyalty might never have been exactly what I thought it was, and the worst was yet to come. When I married him, I was 36. He had already inherited part of the ranch from his father, and together we grew the herd from 120 to nearly 340 head over the years. It wasn't luck, it was discipline. We woke up at 5, strong coffee, the radio tuned to the local news. He went to the fields. I organized the accounts at the kitchen table before heading out to help with whatever was needed. At night, we reviewed expenses and planned the next season in a brown leather ledger I still keep to this day. In a small Montana town, a long marriage is a badge of character, and that is how we were seen. We always sat in the same pew every Sunday. He helped fix the roof when it was needed. I organized the community meals after the service. We were never ones to draw attention. Our reputation was built in silence. Our faith was never loud. It was routine, prayers before meals, a verse taped to the fridge, the quiet confidence that if we did right, God would take care of the rest. For 30 years, I never had a concrete reason to doubt him. But looking back now, I realize the signs started small. So small they felt almost unfair to question. About 2 years ago, he started spending more time in the barn after dinner. He'd say he needed to check the numbers or the feed. I believed him. I always believed him. Then came the quick trips to the neighboring town to negotiate equipment. Before, he discussed every detail with me. Suddenly he said he'd handle it alone so I wouldn't have to worry. He also began to get irritable whenever I mentioned succession planning. I wanted to leave everything organized for our nephews. We didn't have children, but we always saw our family as the natural continuation of the property. He'd change the subject, or say we still had time. There were changes in his appearance, too. New shirts I hadn't bought, an unusual care with his hair before going to the co-op. Nothing glaring, nothing a reasonable wife could turn into an accusation. And I was always reasonable. There was one night his phone buzzed on the table. He was in the shower. The screen lit up with a notification. No name, just a number. When he came back and saw I'd noticed, he grabbed the phone too quickly and said it was just spam. I wanted to believe him. Perhaps that was my greatest flaw, confusing peace with the absence of confrontation. I grew up learning that marriage requires endurance, that suffering in silence is sometimes a sign of maturity, that not every discomfort needs to become an argument. So I swallowed my doubts like bitter medicine, but something inside me began to shift, a slight restlessness. It wasn't jealousy, it was a sense of exclusion, like decisions were being made in a room of the house where I no longer had a key. He started insisting on reviewing documents alone. He said I worked too hard, that he wanted to spare me. For years he trusted me with every cent that came in and out of that ranch. Suddenly, I was being spared. I started noticing small gaps in the books, transfers that didn't appear in my records. When I asked, he had ready-made answers, technical, fast, final, and I accepted them. At church, we still sat in the same pew. He held my hand during prayers. People called us an example. I wondered if it was possible for a marriage to begin to split apart without anyone noticing, not even the wife herself. The day I found that box in the barn wasn't the start of the problem. It was just the moment I stopped pretending nothing was wrong. And even then, I still didn't know the full scale of what lay behind those papers. I only knew that, for the first time in 32 years, I was afraid of what I might find. After the bank meeting, I stopped being just a wife. I began to observe like a rancher watching a crop threatened by an invisible blight. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront him in the kitchen. I didn't cry in front of him. I kept waking up at 5, making coffee, feeding the weak calves, and organizing the books. But now, I compared every single number. The following week, I went back to the bank alone. I told the manager I needed to review old documents for estate purposes. He hesitated for a few seconds before handing me the copies. That's where I saw the loans. 2 major filings made in the last 18 months. Amounts far too high for standard maintenance. The property was used as partial collateral. My signature was missing, replaced by a legal clause I had never seen before. I knew this ranch better than anyone. I knew its margins. Those numbers weren't for the business. And then I found the recurring transfers linked to the same name from the metal box. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was financial. I drove home slowly down the dirt road. The sky was wide and clear, as it always is in Montana. The world looked far too normal for what I was carrying in the passenger seat. In the days that followed, I gathered the pieces, receipts from the neighboring town, conversations that cut short when I entered the room. His phone always face down. Passwords changed. I didn't need physical proof, but it came anyway. One afternoon, I went to the co-op under the pretext of checking a feed order. There, I saw the woman whose name appeared in the records. Younger, maybe early 40s, well-kept hair, a confident posture. She greeted me politely, and with a type of recognition that pierced right through me. It wasn't guilt in her eyes, it was knowledge. In that moment, I knew this wasn't recent. I went home and sat at the table with every statement spread out. I did what I've done my whole life. I organized the numbers. I added up the values. I subtracted the transfers. I projected the debt. I discovered that nearly 22% of the property was compromised. If something went wrong, we could lose land that had been in the family for 3 generations. The betrayal stopped being personal. It became a concrete threat to the home I helped build. I began to review old documents kept in boxes in the basement. I found records of my own financial contributions over the decades. Cattle sales I negotiated, loans paid with reserves I managed. I wasn't just a spouse, I was a co-builder of that ranch, and he was putting it all at risk. At church, the looks started to change, or maybe I just started seeing things I had ignored before. Subtle comments about new investments, whispers about financial moves. In a small town, nothing stays hidden for long. I still didn't confront him. But one night, when I casually mentioned the need to review all contracts together, he reacted with an irritability that didn't fit the question. He said I was being too suspicious, that he just wanted to expand the business, that I needed to trust him. Trust. The word echoed differently that night. I went up to bed before him and sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at my hands, worn by time and work, 32 years of partnership, and now I was being treated as an obstacle. The payments continued, the loans were active, and I still didn't know how much more was hidden. But one thing became clear. If I didn't act with a calm head, I could lose not just my marriage, but the land that sustained my entire life. The hardest night wasn't at the bank. It was a common Tuesday, after dinner, when he left saying he needed to settle something in the barn. The house felt too quiet. I took my chair out to the porch, as I've done since I became an adult. The fields were dark. The wind moved the dry grass like slow waves. In the distance, I could hear the cattle settling before sleep. I had always loved that sound. It was stability. It was home. That night, it felt fragile. I sat there for hours. I didn't cry right away. I think when pain is that deep, it takes time to find a path out. I thought about the 32 years, the brutal winters we faced together, the droughts that nearly broke us. I thought about the prayers said while holding hands in the kitchen, and I asked myself, at what point did I stop being a partner and start being a spectator? For the first time, I didn't pray for God to restore my marriage. I prayed for clarity. I prayed for the wisdom to act without destroying what was still dignified within me. And right there, on that porch, something shifted. I realized that dignity doesn't depend on a man staying by your side. It depends on how you respond when you discover the truth. I could have confronted him in a rage. I could have exposed him at church. But that wouldn't protect the ranch. It wouldn't protect my future. And it wouldn't return the respect he had already compromised. So I decided to act as I always have, with organization. The following week, I drove to the neighboring town. I didn't tell anyone. I booked a consultation with a lawyer specializing in agricultural property. I brought copies of everything: contracts, transfers, old records proving my direct involvement in building our assets. The lawyer listened in silence. He flipped through every document carefully. When he finished, he said something simple. "Ma'am, you have more rights than you realize." I left that office not with a sense of victory, but of lucidity. I spent the following days organizing files, separating decades of receipts, updating inventories, reviewing old clauses I had helped draft years ago. No arguments, no shouting. He noticed my change. He asked why I was being so formal with paperwork. I told him it was just prudence. Inside me, there was no more naivety, there was strategy. I legally secured my share of the property. I structured measures to prevent new transfers without my signature. I protected what took a lifetime to build. I still slept in the same bed. I still sat beside him in church. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer trying to save the appearance of a marriage. I was saving my own integrity. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt a different kind of peace. Not the peace of denial, but the peace of someone who decided they would no longer be deceived. The consequences didn't come with thunder. They came like a Montana winter, slow, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. About 3 months after my visit to the lawyer, one of the loans began to strain the ranch's cash flow. The promising investment he had made brought no return. Instead, it generated arrears. The bank called again. This time, I was ready. Thanks to the legal measures I took, my portion of the property was protected. The clauses he used to manipulate a loan now required my formal signature, and I signed nothing without a detailed analysis. He began to feel the weight. The woman from the co-op, the one whose name was on the records, scaled back her visits. Then the recurring payments stopped. When financial instability replaces promises, certain loyalties evaporate. At church, the comments became less subtle. Not because of me, I never said a word, but financial trouble in a small town doesn't go unnoticed. Suppliers began to collect more firmly. A piece of equipment was repossessed for lack of payment. The man who always lectured about prudence began to be quietly questioned by his own peers. And I remained upright. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't denounce him. When he finally tried to talk to me, not with arrogance, but with exhaustion, I was no longer the same woman who found that box in the barn. He admitted some of his mistakes, not all. Pride takes time to die. But the financial reality spoke louder than any justification. The marriage ended not with an explosion, but with a signature. Silent, organized, dignified. I scaled back the ranch operations. I sold part of the herd to balance the books. I kept only what was necessary to sustain the land and myself. A nephew began helping me with the heavier work. The production became smaller but stable. For the first time in decades, the decisions were exclusively mine. They were hard nights. I won't romanticize it. There is a type of solitude that visits a woman after 60 when she realizes she has to start over. But that solitude was lighter than living beside a lie. My faith changed too. I stopped praying for the restoration of something that was no longer healthy. I began to give thanks for clarity, for protection, for having found out before it was too late. Today, when I sit on the porch, the wind still sweeps across the fields the same way. But my gaze is different. I am no longer the wife who endured in silence for fear of shaking our stability. I am the woman who understood that stability built on concealment is not stability, it is an illusion. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue. Months after the formal separation, he no longer holds the same place in the community. not out of revenge on my part, but because of his own choices. The ranch he tried to use as collateral for validation was almost lost. The woman who received the payments moved on, and I remained, not intact, but whole. Today I attend church without embarrassment. People look at me with respect, not out of pity, but for my character. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth, when sustained with calm, speaks for itself. I learned that dignity is stronger than betrayal, that faith doesn't prevent pain, it prevents pain from turning us into something lesser, and that it is never too late to reclaim your own voice, even if it is used in silence. If you are living through something that threatens your peace right now, let me ask you, are you protecting appearances, or are you protecting your dignity? If this story spoke to your heart, share in the comments what you learned from it. And if you're not subscribed yet, join the channel. Sometimes a woman's strength makes no noise, but it changes the course of an entire generation. Months later, on a clear spring morning, I walked to the barn alone, the same corner where I found the metal box. For a moment I stood there, smelling the dry hay and old wood. The place that marked the beginning of the rupture now seemed like just wood and dust. I realized something simple. The space didn't carry the betrayal. I did, and I was no longer carrying that weight. The box was gone. The contracts had been filed away by the lawyer. The financial issues were being resolved within his share. I kept my portion of the land, reorganized, lean, sustainable. Some people in town tried to approach me with curiosity disguised as concern. I thanked them but never offered details. I didn't turn my pain into a spectacle. Over time, the narrative stopped being the betrayed wife and became the woman who took over the ranch. That made a difference. I learned to drive the large tractor myself. I hired seasonal help only when necessary. I cut superfluous spending. I simplified my life. Curiously, the less I tried to prove anything to anyone, the more respect I received. There was one specific Sunday I hold dear. I was sitting in the same church pew, but not in the same spot. I chose another, not out of resentment, just because I could. During the final hymn, I felt a tranquility that didn't come from an absence of memories, but from an absence of fear. I was no longer afraid of discovering anything, because I had already discovered the worst, and I survived. Today, when women in the community ask me how I managed to be so strong, I answer honestly, I wasn't strong all the time. I was organized, I was patient, and I refused to act out of humiliation. There is a massive difference between reacting to hurt and acting to protect. I chose to protect. Protect my share of the land, protect my story, protect my conscience, protect. My ex-husband still lives in the region. Our paths sometimes cross at the co-op or on the road. There is no hatred. There is also no intimacy. There is consequence, and consequence is a firm but fair teacher. If I could go back in time, maybe I would have asked more questions when the first signs appeared. Maybe I would have demanded more transparency before the distance grew. But I also know that every step, including the mistake of trusting too much, brought me to the woman I am now. And this woman no longer lives to maintain appearances. She lives to maintain principles. When the sun sets behind the mountains and the golden light covers the fields, I still give thanks, not for what I lost, but for what I recovered, my voice, my lucidity, my peace. Because in the end, the true inheritance we preserve is not just land or assets. It is character, and character, when protected with dignity, weathers any betrayal. Today, 2 years after everything came to light, the ranch is no longer the largest in the region, but it is the most honest it has ever been. I reduced the herd to just over 180 head, enough to keep the land productive without depending on risky loans. The fences have been reinforced. The barn received simple repairs, nothing luxurious. I learned that growth without peace isn't worth the price. My nephew comes 3 times a week. He has the energy I no longer have and a respect for the family history. I don't make grand promises about inheritance. I just teach him what I know, how to read the weather, how to calculate risk without greed, how to never hide numbers from those who share the responsibility. This might be the most important part of it all. Because betrayal doesn't start big, it starts small. It starts when someone decides not to share a decision, when they choose validation outside the home instead of dialogue within it, when pride speaks louder than partnership. I also had to face something difficult, my own tendency to accept too much silence. I confused the absence of conflict with harmony. Today, I understand that maturity is also about asking uncomfortable questions. My faith matured in this process. I no longer see God as someone who prevents storms. I see him as the one who sustains us when the wind tears away what we thought was permanent. There was no miracle that restored my marriage. There was discernment that restored my dignity, and that was enough. Some nights I still think about the 32 years I lived beside him. I don't erase them. I don't despise them. They were real. There was love. There was true partnership for a long time. But there was also a wrong choice, and every choice produces fruit. His was the gradual loss of trust, stability, and respect. Mine was clarity, autonomy, and peace. If you're listening to me and feel that something is not aligned in your own life, I'm not going to tell you to run away or face everything with an explosion. I will say, observe, organize, pray for lucidity, not for revenge, protect what is yours with serenity, because dignity isn't noise, it's a stance. And a stance, when maintained under pressure, redefines the future. I still wake up at 5 in the morning. I still make strong coffee. I still walk the fields before the sun fully rises. The difference is that now, every decision that sustains this land passes through my conscious hands. I no longer carry the need to seem strong. I simply am firm. And if there is one thing I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it is this. It is never too late to recover what you silently surrendered to others. Sometimes God doesn't remove the pain. He reveals the truth, and the truth, when faced with quiet courage, returns us to ourselves. If this story reflected something of your own journey, write it in the comments. Your experience might strengthen another woman who is still trying to figure out what to do. And remember, protecting your dignity is not a lack of faith. It is maturity. There's one last thing I need to say, not as a victim, but as a woman who walked through the fire and came out with her conscience intact. For a long time, I believed that loyalty meant staying, no matter the cost. Today I know that true loyalty is not staying in a lie. It is staying in the truth. When it all came out, some people expected me to become bitter, to harden, to use the story as ammunition against him. But bitterness is just a second prison. And I had already been surprised by a locked box once. I wouldn't allow my heart to become another. I chose something harder, responsibility without hatred, responsibility for protecting what was mine without needing to destroy what was left of him. There is a silent strength that only appears when a woman stops trying to save the reputation of her marriage and starts saving her own soul. That is what I did. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, but after so many years, doesn't it hurt? It hurts. It hurts to realize signs were ignored. It hurts to understand that trust was used as cover, but it hurts less than living while pretending nothing happened. Today I walk the same fields where I once thought everything was guaranteed simply because it was old. Nothing is guaranteed just because it is long. Respect is not automatic. Transparency is not optional. And faith does not mean closing your eyes. If there is an inheritance I want to leave for those who come after me, it isn't just the land. It's the example that a 68-year-old woman can start over. She can reorganize. She can learn legal clauses. She can face the community's gaze without lowering her head. She can pray without asking for the truth to disappear, but asking for the courage to face it. I didn't lose everything. I lost the illusion, and curiously, that set me free. Today, when I close the door at night, I no longer wonder what is hidden. I know exactly where I stand, and that, after everything, is peace. If this story walked with you this far, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Write down what you learned. Subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the story of a mature woman is exactly what another needs to hear to find the courage to act with wisdom. Remember, betrayal can shake the structure, but dignity, well guarded, sustains any reconstruction.